Hello and welcome to the webinar of the ILO Global Business and Disability Network. What's in a number? Disability data for business change. Audiocast quality is subject to your equipment, available bandwidth, and internet traffic. If you experience unsatisfactory audio quality, please use the telephone dial-in option provided in your confirmation and reminder emails. If you have dialed in, operator assistance is available by pressing #. You can send questions at any time by using the Q&A window located to the lower left of the presentation screen. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. And now I will turn the call over to Stefan Trommel from the International Labour Organization. Go ahead, Stefan.
Yes, thank you, Luke, and good afternoon, good morning, and depending on where you are. I'm Stefan Trommel from the International Labour Organization, also in charge of the Secretariat of the Global Business and Disability Network, which is the organization that is hosting this webinar. We're going to have presentations from 4 speakers whom we have kindly asked to stick to 5 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have chance for Q&A, which, as Luke mentioned, you are kindly asked to submit via chat. Let me briefly explain why we decided to focus on this topic, and let me give the example of the ILO. The ILO is an organization that is not allowed to ask its employees whether they have a disability or not. It's subject to privacy and confidentiality. At the same time, we as an organization want to know whether over time we are becoming or not a more welcoming organization. So we want to know whether the number of staff with disabilities is going up, whether new employees are coming into the organization that would see themselves as having a disability. And we would also like to know whether those staff with disabilities, how well they are doing compared with non-disabled staff, for instance, through a staff satisfaction survey. So the purpose of the webinar today is to help us, and we have the same challenge as other global organizations, in particular global companies, how to address this in a way that allows organizations to monitor progress while at the same time fully respecting the rights of people with disability. And that is what we are trying to achieve with the webinar today. Just a brief comment on logistics. You see closed captioning being provided at the bottom of your screen. And as I mentioned, please enter comments at the text box to your left. I will introduce each of the speakers one after the other. And after their presentation, I will probably ask each of them a short follow-up question. I will start with Angela Matthews. Angela Matthews is the head of policy and advice at the Business and Disability Forum in the UK, which is a key active partner of the Global Business and Disability Network. BDF has been working in depth with companies on these issues, and I think it's great to have Angela with us today, because she will set the stage on this important and complex issue and will explain us the reasons that business are doing it and how they're doing it in a way that fully respects the rights of people with disabilities. Angela, the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining. Greetings from London. So I head up an advice service here at Business Disability Forum, and the issue of data monitoring is one of the issues that we talk about a lot. And I've been at BDF for 5 years, and it's never really dropped off the agenda. People have been talking about it in various different ways. The conversation has moved quite rapidly and got more sophisticated. And in our global task force, we've recently been doing some research, and we'll shortly be releasing some research on how organisations across the globe approach the issue of measuring disability in their organisation. So when we talk about measuring disability in our organisation, the term people and organisations usually use when they're talking about that is data monitoring. However, in our capacity here at BDF as advisors, we actually don't talk about data that much when we're talking about this issue. What we find ourselves talking about more is about organising emotions about how we think about ourselves and how employers, employer strategies and language are considerate to how we identify and how we want to talk about ourselves at work. So what that means is that we have four key things really that we talk about on this issue of data monitoring, and interestingly, none of them include data. So the first thing we speak to organisations about when they're approaching data monitoring is, first of all, what are your motivations for this? Secondly, we'll explore the cultural climate, for want of a better phrase, of their organisation. We'll then look at language quite a lot, and then the last thing, the fourth thing that we speak a lot about is information ethics. So, and how employers look after these very personal stories and very personal details of employees. And what we find is, if one of those four things are sort of not considered or sort of out of sync with one another, then that really affects the data return of employees. So really, and when you're looking at those four things, what we're really talking about is changing your business and also changing how your employees feel about being part of your business as well. So this is a huge identity issue. So first of all, as I said, motivations. We speak to organisations about why do you want to do this? And the four things usually come up. I think the most important thing to remember here is that collecting information about disability or diversity data, as lots of organisations here in the UK will call it, is generally an output, which it should be just one output that's part of a wider outcome. So what are you trying to do? And organisations tell us, for the most part, four common things. Firstly, they're trying to find out how many people with disabilities they have in their organisation. The second thing we hear quite a lot is they want to increase the disclosure, and there's lots of research in the UK about use of the term disclosure and how well employees do or don't respond to that term disclosure and how that can affect how employees tell you about their disability. So increasing the disclosure level of employees who say they have a disability, we usually see that is closely linked to employers who have a target or are trying to meet a quota. The third thing we hear about quite a lot is I want to measure the number of effective employees in my organisation because I want to advance the inclusive culture. And then the other is to understand the extent of adjustments that are used in the workforce to help plan resources. So they're quite four different things. And actually, when we look at those things, data might not be the answer to how you achieve those things. So, for example, particularly around, we've seen quite a lot in the UK, even global organisations operating who have a presence in the UK are finding that the more inclusive their culture is, actually the less likely disabled employees are telling the organisation that they have a disability. And this is generally because when an employee makes their workplace adjustments work well and it's speedy and it's easy to use, when communications are inclusive, when your building is accessible, actually you don't need to ask for adjustments, and therefore why would you tell an organisation about your disability? So there's some really interesting things there that we first sort out with an organisation. You know, what is it you're trying to achieve? And is collecting data actually going to help you do that? And the other thing that we see quite a lot, and which is so important for organisations to sort of really respect, really, is that collecting data is actually a whole organisation action. So when we see employee surveys, when we see organisations collecting data, we rarely see that there's one department or one team involved in that. What we often see is that senior leaders are communicating that this is what we're doing, this is why we want to do it. And there's also a huge communications presence, so there needs to be a comms strategy behind this. Employee networks are usually involved as well, and encouraging other employees to understand why this is being done, but also to, I'm doing little air quotes here, disclose their disability. And of course, HR are involved, and sometimes, well, a lot of the time, if data collection is being done digitally, obviously comms and IT will be involved. So from those business areas there, we already see that actually this is data collection is involving a lot of business areas. It's not just one team that are responding to this. And that means you need a clear strategy for data collection. And it also means that all of those departments need to be speaking to each other. The second thing that we see is really crucial and that we spend quite a lot of time talking to organisations about when they're putting a data collection strategy together is what is your climate like at the moment? So, for example, if you've got a huge number of bullying and harassment disability-related cases, if you've got a huge issue with your absence management or performance management policies or procedures, if you're restructuring or if there are redundancies going on at the moment, we see that can really affect how the level of response you get when you're asking these questions. And the other thing that a lot of organisations in the UK are really sort of conscious of is survey fatigue. So, and that's the title there, that's the phrase they use over here, which is, we've got our employee survey, we've got our accessibility survey, we've got our diversity survey, we've also got our supplier survey. So our employees are getting so many surveys, if they see another survey, they're just going to hit delete and not bother looking at it. And similarly to that is the warmth, of an organisational conversation. And what we mean by that is if this is sending out a survey and asking employees to fill out a survey, I'm sorry, there was a glitch on my phone there. I hope you can still hear me. So I was saying about the warmth of the organisational conversation. If this is the first time that you put out a disability-related ask or communication, then this is probably, we see this is met with suspicion quite a lot. Employees will probably be less likely to fill the questionnaire in. So what we see is there often needs to be a clear strategy for how you communicate this is going to happen and what's going to be followed up after that. So I'm not going to talk for much longer because I'm conscious I'm going over my time. But we do have some more slides on this deck from me, and please let me know if you have questions.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you for identifying some of the challenges that companies, organizations face when they address this issue, and also the relevance of the communication that needs to surround such an exercise if there is any possibility of success. Let me ask you a very quick follow-up question, because in the run-up to this webinar, there was even this discussion whether should we really even recommend organizations to try to monitor data, or is it just something which organizations should just focus on becoming more inclusive and not asking about the data? So I was just wondering, in the context of BDF, would you see that your members sort of are global and local members? Would you see them more and more interested in having numbers, or what is the feeling in terms of companies trying to have these data, or companies deciding, well, we should not have these data? What would be your assessment in that respect?
Yeah, really interesting question. And actually, there's a sector nuance there that we find. So in the UK, we have something called the public sector equality duty. So for public sector organisations, there is a duty for them to be transparent with their diversity and inclusion activity, particularly around reporting numbers. So it's not a quota that they have to fill. It's not a quota or a target, but the Public Sector Equality Duty, which sits under our Equality Act 2010, actually requires public sector organisations to report on how things are in their organisation, which often good practice would include that you report the number of people who have a disability in your organisation. But we see for other organisations, like they really don't want to get bogged down with data and counting the number of employees because they recognise how difficult this can be, and in terms of logistics and how you spend your resources. And, you know, if some people are not going to fill in the survey, all you're ever going to get is the number of employees who tell you. You're not going to actually get a specific, accurate picture of how many disabled employees there actually are. So we see quite in the public sector, the private sector are generally more focused on being inclusive and sorting out processes and policies. That said, there is also that good practice in the public sector as well, but there is this additional duty to report.
Thank you, Angela. That's very useful. Colleagues, we have now, people have been joining the webinar gradually. We have a bit over 80 participants. We had 260 persons that had expressed their interest and had pre-registered. And just as it was mentioned at the beginning, the webinar is being recorded for those that cannot follow it or cannot follow it fully. You can then listen to it later on, and we will provide the link about it. A reminder on the logistics, you have the Q&A box at the left side of your screen through which you can send us questions which we will try to feed back to the panel towards the end of the webinar. I'm now moving on to our next speaker, Andrea Hall. Andrea is a global diversity leader at DXC Technology, a company that became a member of the Global Business Disability Network in June this year. DXC has a presence in over 70 countries, 170,000 employees, if my memory does not fail me. And DXC has just started a global campaign on self-identification of its staff. And Andrea is here joining us. Thanks a lot, Andrea, to share with us the first feedback from this ambitious campaign. Andrea, the floor over to you.
Hi, everyone. Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. So my name is Andrea, and I am with DXC, and I do want to quickly share that we at DXC just became a company in April of 2017. We are a recent merger of CSC Computer Sciences Corporation and Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Services. So in my role leading diversity recruiting, my role is actually a new role that was just created for the company. So as we started this journey of diversity recruitment and outreach, and I really needed to understand where we were before I could decide where we needed to go. So I started with taking a look at all of the countries where we do business, of those 70 countries, and really identifying where we had requirements. And you can see here by this visual representation that demonstrated in black all of the countries where we currently do business, that there are governmental-driven requirements by departments of labor or ministries of labor, et cetera, where there are either penalties for not meeting goals around hiring people with disabilities, or where there are benefits in meeting those. And the goals are different from country to country, so I've sort of given you some information over to the left for the percentages that are required in those countries. So pretty significant that 25 of our 70 countries had some sort of a requirement. So next I had to ask myself, well, how well are we doing with hiring and retention in those countries? And so what I discovered is that some countries were doing fantastic. They had great programs with outreach and recruitment and community partners, et cetera. And then other countries weren't doing so well. As I continued the conversation, what I soon discovered was that there was not a single tool to track data globally. Countries were collecting data in different ways and using a variety of tools. So the first step really in our journey was to create a single source of truth. So for the better part of 2017, we worked with a company called Workday to create a place where employees could safely enter their appropriate diversity demographics into a tool throughout the world. And we had to make sure that in each country we used, appropriate language, that we used appropriate definitions of what it means to have a disability, that we entered into the tool that, that there's an understanding that this is voluntary and that there was an option to choose to not disclose information, and that employees understood that none of this information would be shared about them, that this information is only being used in the aggregate. So in April of 2018, we sort of kicked off our Go Live, starting with our new hires, and give them an opportunity to update their demographic information. And then in July of 2018, a couple months later, we kicked off a global self-identification campaign. And so let me click to the next slide. So how do we do that? So we did that with a host of communications. The first starting with our CHRO, our Chief Human Resources Officer, that went out to the entire globe to let them know that these self-identification campaigns were going to be going on. And then country by country, we have been reaching out through our HR vice president for that company, for that country, the invitation to self-identify using the Workday tool. And so we used a series of WIFMs of kind of what's in it for me to the employees to help them understand why we were interested in collecting this data, and to help them understand that they were helping us to improve on our inclusion and diversity programs in their countries by helping us demonstrate how many people that we have in that country with disability, how many people we're willing to disclose, and then helping us understand that in those countries maybe we needed to invest more deeply. So as we rolled out the program, we had to understand and had to be mindful that this is very culturally sensitive and that there's a lot of time sensitivity. Some countries have requirements, like Canada had a requirement in August. We also understood that there are worker council implications in some countries. So we took very granular involvement from teams with labor relations and human resources, also with our legal, and then with Workday subject matter experts, to make sure that we were successful in each country as we rolled the program out. So we wanted to make sure that you understand that if you consider going into something like this, you need to understand that you need to create a timeline. We were conscious that the Workday tool, we could not roll this out globally at once. We would risk shutting the tool down. We've had that experience in the past with a US-based campaign. And we also wanted to encourage you to understand that you need to understand your baseline. So we wanted to look at baseline metrics to see where we are, so we could see whether or not we experienced improvement. As of today, we've completed our self-identification campaigns in the United States and Canada, and we're currently rolling out in the UK and Brazil. Just some quick success metrics. We've gone from 2.5% to 6.55% self-identified employees with disabilities in the United States. And remarkably, in Canada, we've gone from 2.8 to 13.5. So that sort of tells us that in North America, we've made some great strides, but clearly for the U.S., we still have a bit more work to do. The last slide is my contact information. If you have any questions or comments or would like to contact me, I encourage you to do so. Try to be conscious of time. Back over to you.
Andrea, thank you very much for this presentation. It's a very interesting, especially because I anticipate that many other global companies, members of our network, will be particularly interested in following your path and learning from how you did this, what were the challenges, and how you overcame those challenges. I have a very quick question as a follow-up. As you know, and you could see it also with the different percentages of quotas, countries use different definitions of disability. There are many countries that have disability certification systems and other processes. So I was just wondering, how much are you using exactly the same question and, let's say, sort of definition of disability at global level, or are you sort of taking into account national variations around the understanding of who is considered or not a person with a disability?
That's a great question. So actually, for the better part of 2017, we virtually traveled from country to country, understanding what is the definition of disability, how in that country do you self-identify as a person with a disability, and what documentation is required. So the system actually defines disability differently depending on where you access it in the world. So when I look at from a U.S. posture, I'm going to see the Department of Labor's definition of disability, whereas if you enter it from another country, somewhere else in the world, you're going to see your country's specific definition of disability. Also in countries where there is documentation required, there's an allowance in the tool to upload that documentation if you choose to do so.
Excellent.
But the one thing that we did make clear across the countries where there is not a requirement, we simply asked disability status, and then we invited people to understand that this information is voluntary, and that if they choose to not disclose, that's also an option.
Yes, thanks. Very important consideration. I'm moving now to the third speaker on our panel, Suzanne Maria. Suzanne is the director of the Youngstown Institute on Employment and Disability at Cornell University in the U.S., also a member of the Global Business and Disability Network. And Suzanne will share with us some research done by the Institute asking companies on how they deal with issues around self-identification. Suzanne, the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thanks to each of you who are joining us today. It's a great, good-sized group, which I'm delighted about. As Stefan says, I'm going to talk about our topic at hand, disability disclosure, from several different sources of Cornell research on workplace disability inclusion. And I'm going to move quickly so that I stay within our timelines, and we want to be able to interact with you and respond to questions. The points I'm going to hit are why disability disclosure is of interest, which we've really pretty much covered, so I won't dwell on. What individuals with disabilities are telling us their reasons are to disclose or not from a study of 600 individuals with disabilities. A few elements about the importance of building a climate for inclusion, which our first speaker, Angela, spoke a bit about, and specifically from our research, the importance of the supervisor, which has crystallized as very critical for us in building a climate for inclusion. And I'll leave you, we won't go over, but you can know that there's quite a bit of references, resources about our research, which you can find online, which I've included at the end of the slides. I think we've covered pretty well why disclose. Many of us, as Andrea so well pointed out, have regulatory frameworks that incent employers to count individuals with disabilities. That's true for about a quarter or more of our own American workforce because of the federal subcontractor requirements under Section 503 of the Rehab Act, as well as our federal sector employer requirements for a percentage of the workforce being people with disabilities. But it's also important because many individuals, especially if you have an aging workforce, do need accommodations. And so being able to comfortably and confidently come forward is really important for them to stay productive and in the workforce. But even beyond that, we really know when people are able to be who they are and bring their whole selves to work, they enjoy their job better, and they're more likely to be productive and stay in their job. So there's many reasons why this is a really important topic for us here today. One of the things that I wanted to share, because I think most often we identify accommodations with disability, and so people become even more hesitant to ask. And I believe Angela made this point as well, that if accommodation requests are a common part of good practice in the organization and everybody can comfortably ask for them and they are not seen as extraordinary, but rather productivity adjustments or tools, it makes it easier for people with disabilities to ask. And we know from national census data in the United States, from the current population survey and a disability supplement that came out in 2012, that the majority of accommodation requests come from people without disabilities. In fact, 95% of people in this survey who said they had made an accommodation request in the last year were people without disabilities. So I think we're doing it all the time. We don't need to make it as special as we do. And by doing that, sending that message within our companies, then we are probably facilitating comfort with disclosure for people with disabilities in the need to ask for an accommodation. In our experience, and also by the requirements of our federal subcontractor regulations, we can ask about disability status at application, during a job interview, once the individual is hired, when an accommodation is needed, and also within defined time periods on a regular basis. And I've included the forms that we use for that process for federal subcontractors for your reference at the end of these slides. So it can be ongoing depending on the regulatory requirements of your and allowances of your particular organization. Another thing we get asked quite frequently is what's the difference between confidentiality of data versus anonymity? And I think it's really important to get clear about that within our respective organizations so that we can convey to the people we may be asking for this information the parameters within which the data is collected. If data is collected and held anonymously, it means that there's no identifying values that can link the data to the individual sharing the information. The organization collecting the data should not be able to identify a specific respondent. And an example of that is perhaps a climate survey or an engagement survey we might do, which can include a disability variable, and we might find out that there's many more people who confidently respond and identify as a person with a disability on that kind of survey than when the data is collected and held with identifiers. In that case, the data should still be confidential, and the individual needs to be notified that their identifying data is held with their response about disability identification or accommodation request, but that data is being kept confidentially, which can heighten the comfort level of the individual. So being very clear about these two distinctions is really important, and you may get very different responses because of how you're characterizing how the data is being held and whether or not identifiers of individual identity accompany their checkbox about disability. We've done, as I mentioned, a survey of 600 individuals with disabilities. We've done many surveys within individual companies and across companies working with HR professionals in our Society for Human Resource Management. This is a survey of 600 individuals with disabilities, and we asked them for the factors within their organization and within themselves that would facilitate or impede disclosure. And what we found is that people were more likely to disclose if they needed an accommodation, 68%, but also if they had a good relationship with their supervisor, about 63%. A little less, but still significant, over half, if they saw a disability-friendly workplace or active disability recruiting, and disability and diversity statements, or knowing of the successes of others individuals who had come forward either to request an accommodation or just to identify as a person with a disability and had a good experience. They also, interesting signals like disability and diversity statements, about half of them said that would be a reason to come forward because it was clear that the organization really were interested in having people with disabilities within their workplace. Only 2 out of 5 said, but this is still important, that it was a belief in new opportunities, that somehow the organization was signaling that if they came forward, they'd be advantaged. Reasons why they would not disclose would be a risk of being fired or not hired to begin with, about 3/4 of them. Around 2/3 said a concern about the employer focusing on disability, or in the U.S., a risk of losing health care, which continues to be an issue for us since we don't have full coverage for everyone in our country. 2/3 felt a limiting of their opportunities, or the supervisor might not be supportive. Around half, risk of being viewed or treated differently was an area of concern, or if there was no impact on job ability, around 2 out of 5. And only about 1/4 said it was a desire for privacy. So it's more a risk of being viewed or treated differently. It's also important to note the importance of the supervisor in these processes, because that is much more likely, in our experience, in our research, to be where disclosure occurs. In separate surveys that we've done within organizations and across organizations, we find that employees with disabilities are at least 60% more likely to disclose their disability to a supervisor than to an HR professional in the more formal system. So educating our supervisors is absolutely critical if we want to facilitate disability disclosure. The conditions people told us that they were more likely to disclose if the perception of disability climate is positive, if they work in what they would describe inclusive climates, if they perceive HR practices to be fairly implemented within the organization more broadly, and they perceive the organization to be genuinely committed to disability. And I gave you some examples of the signals that they're looking at when they say that. And also what I just mentioned, that they have a trusting and a close relationship with their immediate supervisor. That helps a lot. So in summary, I'd like to say employers may have regulatory requirements or affirmative hiring initiatives that increase their interest in having individuals with disabilities disclose those disabilities and enable employers to count them. That's a fact for many of us across many countries now. Individuals with disabilities are more likely to be able to get needed accommodations and maintain being productive in their workforce and make meaningful contributions if they're comfortable disclosing. And we are all advantaged in being able to bring our whole selves to work and contribute our diverse abilities in a workplace. So that is a reason why we want people to feel comfortable. People thrive in inclusive workplaces. And finally, it's important for us to acknowledge and recognize that the manager's role is critical to workplace inclusion, and we need to educate our managers to be able to respond in a way that's supportive to individuals when they want to disclose. And with that, I do have, as you can see here, 6 other slides. I'm going to leave them as resources to you, and I will move this back to Stefan. Stefan, I am not hearing you, so your mute may be on if you're addressing.
Sorry. Thank you, Suzanne. I think we're listening to Angela and now to you. It seems quite clear that there is a difference between disclosure, information that is then held confidentially, and self-identification, which is much more about an anonymous survey and all that. Would I be wrong in assuming that if a company does both things, they would usually have a higher rate of people with self-identified as disabled compared to people who would sort of disclose their disability? Would you have any analysis made of that, also in the context of the obligations that result from the U.S. legislation?
Yes, Stefan, that's absolutely right, and that's a terrific question. And why we encourage companies to do both, to do what is appropriate direct inquiries with identifiers where they can, but also to do anonymous kinds of inquiries on regular routine surveys like engagement surveys, include a disability variable so that they can see how close the self-disclosed confidential-based file where a person may choose to identify is to that more broad anonymous survey. In our experience, it can be anywhere from 3 to 10 times higher in the anonymous survey, which gives us a litmus, which tells us that many individuals are not comfortable having themselves identified for purposes of the formal system, but may in an anonymous survey. So I think it's a great idea to be able to do that. And also, if you keep that data, you can compare the perceptions of individuals and turnover intentions in perceptions of supervisor and job satisfaction and engagement on that survey with people with other either minority representation or your general population in your workforce. And it can also be a telling factor about whether or not you're having climate problems among those different populations. So I do enthusiastically encourage people to attempt to get that data in 2 ways.
Excellent, Suzanne. That is very useful and very clear. Let me now pass to our last speaker, Ruth Warwick. Ruth is the first Vice President of the International Disability Alliance, and we are asking her about the perspective of persons with disabilities. We've heard so far about the point of view of organizations, of companies, and I've seen also in the questions we received from our participants that definitely at least one of the participants is very keen about trying to understand what is the perspective, the point of view of persons with disabilities in this regard. So Ruth, thanks for being with us in the webinar, and the floor is over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, wonderful. So it's my pleasure to be here, and I found that the preceding three presentations very interesting, and excellent points have been made. So disclosure is a topic that is very sensitive. There is a lot of stigma attached to disclosing that one has a disability in many parts of the world. There are actually taboos around disclosing because of the disadvantages that people experience. So it's not surprising that many individuals with disabilities will be somewhat wary and suspicious of disclosing, especially if they need to disclose for job purposes. However, we also recognize that disclosing brings benefits, and it is part of our process to encourage individuals to disclose in order to get the adjustments and accommodations and to help create an inclusive workplace. So when we talk of disclosure, we're talking about disclosure at many different levels, and it's often very situational. Individuals in applying for jobs probably would not disclose if they felt that there was no benefit to doing so. Once having gotten a position, then there may be benefits to disclosing in order to get the needed adjustments and accommodations. And what we need to do is create workplaces where people feel that confident and comfortable in doing so, recognizing that the individuals they're disclosing to have much more influence and are in a position of power. It is recognized, however, as well that overall data surveys serve a useful purpose. From the point of view of the International Disability Alliance, we have been very supportive of having measures to measure progress and having data collected for the Sustainable Development Goals, or to measure the achievements as a result of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So when we talk about collecting data in organizations in the workplace, that also translates into something that would be useful and viewed as useful as long as the purpose of the data collection is clear. So that purpose, from my personal point of view, should not just be to meet government regulations, but should be to actually improve the workplace, make it more inclusive, ensure that the necessary adjustments are in place, ensure that we're doing the things that we need that change the numbers from a low 2% to as high as 13%, as had been mentioned by a previous speaker for a situation in Canada. I think that we need to consult with people with disabilities in this process. Employees within a specific company need to know exactly what is the purpose of a survey and have buy-in. Through that participation, they themselves will be able to convey their support and bring more people alongside in order to support people's participation in conducting surveys in the workplace. Now, we've also, I want to touch on accommodations regarding surveys. So we need to ensure that people can actually participate in a survey. For deaf people, it might be that the survey is in sign language. It might be that it needs to be in plain language, or that if there are videos, that they might need to be captioned. We can't underestimate the message that it sends to people when we ensure that the actual instrument itself is accessible to people with disabilities. And then we should also talk about what happens with the results. Often people with disabilities are asked to give input without results being also something that they have an opportunity to share and help shape in. So I think that is a necessary result. Through some positive examples, I think we will see more support for people to do surveys, and certainly organizations of people with disabilities are very happy to work with employers in order to bring about inclusive policies and to help them do surveys where people with disabilities are identifying their needs, and as a result, we can see improvements for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for these very important comments from the perspective of persons with disabilities. I will now pass the floor over to Peter, who has been filtering the questions we have received from participants and will now pass them on to the panel in the bit more 10 minutes that are left for the webinar. Peter, the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you for all the speakers for really provoking interventions. We don't have so much time left, and we've already had quite a few questions coming in. So I'm afraid we won't be able to respond to everyone, but the speakers have given their contact details in their presentations, and we can share any of those further if you want to make contact after the webinar. So I'm going to go around each of the speakers, highlight a couple of things that have been raised and ask the speakers to respond for those and give final remarks, all in a very brief 1 or 2 minutes each. So as you see, we really challenge our speakers on these webinars. I'd especially thank Florence Chapman and Nabilo, who have both given a lot of comments on and a lot of questions for the speakers, which I'm sure will continue discussion. Angela, I want to turn first to you for any final remarks from you, and a couple of questions that have come up, which is how to kind of bridge these gaps between conversations in different places that need data, and that data might be more important in one area and not in another, and how that links in the journey for inclusion.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So in terms of bridging conversations and how that might look in terms of data, I mean, I think what we need to be careful of is that it's viewing data collection or disclosure, for want of a better term, as a static thing that happens once. Actually, what we see, particularly here in the UK, we have, as I'm sure you know, quite a large disability employment gap. And one of the things that we see is that disabled people are falling out of work when they don't get adjustments. And one of the things that we've seen in some of our research is this thing of ongoing disclosure. So for an employee who says, I have a disability, and so I might have a hearing impairment, for example, and I need an interpreter, that might then be given there, but then the need for that adjustment, not that the person has a disability, but that the adjustment is recorded, sometimes that doesn't happen. And then, so for the next meeting, they need to say again, I have a hearing impairment and I need an interpreter. And then that's given there and then. Again, because the adjustment hasn't been recorded as an adjustment, again, not the disability, they are finding that they're having to repeatedly disclose. So that's one issue for us. And I think that the second thing is about the term disclosure is quite a technical term that not all employees, certainly in the UK, know that they're doing it when they do it. And I think particularly when the difference between what a line manager or supervisor understands to be disclosure disclosure and what an employee understands to be disclosure is quite different. So we might see an employee saying, "Oh, I felt low," or my blood sugars have been higher," and then an educated line manager might think, and they've got things going off in their head, which is, do I need to have the talk about adjustment? And that might kickstart the process, whereas the employee doesn't see it like that. They are just having a conversation. And I think also what we see in the UK as well is also the repeated disclosures that happen through processes as well. So, for example, at application, you would disclose again when you are selected for a role, and then again on day one as well. So we see sort of repeated disclosures happening quite a lot, and they're not always recorded, or sometimes the disability is recorded, and the reason for having the conversation, i.e. I need an adjustment, is not always recorded. So what that tells us is that collecting data doesn't make you a good employer. It's recording the adjustments and making sure that employees don't need to repeatedly disclose. That's what's making the most inclusive employers here in the UK.
Thanks, Angela, for the advice and both the technical details and the way to go forward on the important journey of inclusion. Andrea, a few questions came in for you, but as we just have 1 or 2 minutes for your intervention, one question that came up was particularly about retention. I don't know if you've been able to measure that at all, and any final remarks from your side?
Yeah, I actually addressed that question directly. I think what I was trying to say there on that particular slide is that when we look at government requirements around people with disabilities in the workplace, we're asked to look at 2 sets of demographics. We're asked to look at new hires. So how are you reaching out to the external community to attract people with disabilities into the workplace? So you're measured on how many people you're hiring into your workplace. And then where I mentioned retention of people with disabilities, that is where countries are measuring you then by how many people you have in your workforce. So what are you doing internally to create inclusivity, to make people feel comfortable to bring their whole selves to work, and then being able to measure your entire workforce demographic to say, okay, this is where we are, and are we where we want to be, and if not, what do we need to do to make improvements? So that was my comment around retention. It's really more around the workforce.
Thanks, Andrea, and I think that echoes what Angela was saying about how these conversations are a journey. Suzanne, coming quickly to you, a couple of people raised mental health and psychosocial issues and whether that might influence disclosure or that might be different. So flag that for you, but also any final comment from your side.
Thank you, Peter. And that's a terrific question because indeed we do find that around the area of mental health, both employers feel not well prepared to deal with these issues, I'm afraid, often, and individuals are far more hesitant because of the historical stigma around mental health related issues. So it is more challenging, and I think at the same time, workplaces and just in sheer prevalence, it's become a bigger issue. There is much more anxiety, much more depression evident among our workplaces and our labor force. So it is an issue we should be on top of. And again, people's willingness to come forward and acknowledge that they need support in this area has a lot to do with the workplace climate. So proactive company initiatives around mental health and raising awareness without identifying individuals can really help to build a culture around these issues that make people more comfortable coming forward. And I just want to again say thank you to you and the ILO for helping us to put this together. It was, I think, a really timely, for many of us, a timely topic. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think you've brought out another side of the journey in response to that specific question. Ruth, just coming to you. Maybe I won't ask you a specific question. Feel free to pick up anything specific, but any final remarks from your side on the things that have been discussed?
Yes, I wanted to pick up on the issue of anonymity and the distinction between confidentiality and anonymity, which I think is very important. So it will depend on the nature of the disclosure. If it's a more almost census-like survey, information will be aggregated, and individuals need to know that their input is anonymous, and that it will be dealt with in a broader system-wide way, because if you then deal with it only by the unit in which a person works, that outs the individual and deals with the results not being anonymous. So it's not just guaranteeing anonymity in terms of how the data is collected, but also how it's displayed and how it's shared. That is really important. Obviously, at the level of dealing with adjustments, then you're going to have a different type of disclosure that is much more individually based than a survey-based approach. And there, the confidentiality of a situation is important for the individual to feel that they could share it with their supervisor or HR person. And that information is not then shared with other individuals without their consent. And I also wanted to emphasize the point that all of this is voluntary, that the individual should never be coerced into taking part in a survey or having to disclose a disability.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ruth, for very important reminders to finish on. Thanks to everyone who's inputted questions. We couldn't get to them all. So some of them were on much, much bigger issues beyond the scope of this webinar. Please see the GBIDN website, businessanddisability.org, for kind of further materials that explore all these issues. That's all from me. Thanks to the speakers from my side. And Stefan, if you can close off the webinar for us.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Peter. We've had around 80 participants at the webinar, and the good news is that almost all of them stayed throughout the webinar, which I think shows the level of interest that the issue has brought and the quality of the presentations. From my side, I can only thank the panel and the participants, because I think the discussion has brought our knowledge to a higher level. We are planning to come up with a short fact sheet that identifies some of the key issues that we have been discussing. We will also be looking carefully into the questions that we have not been able to address and which were related to the topic. I think we can use some of them as part of a sort of frequently asked question part of that fact sheet. I also want to mention that one of the questions we got is, as I mentioned before, the seminar is being recorded and people can listen to it and watch the slides at your own pace. And in the future, it will be included also on our website as one of the resources that is available to all companies and other organizations working on this. Just a final plea to all of you: if you have 2 more minutes, I think an evaluation form will pop up in a second. It will take you 2 minutes to sort of give us a very quick feedback on things that you liked or disliked in our webinar, and that information will definitely allow us to improve even more the webinars that we are planning to hold in the coming months. So again, thank you to all of you. Particular thanks to the panel. Thanks also to Peter, who has been helping us to set this webinar up, and of course special thanks to all of you who have been participating at the meeting and with the questions that you've asked. Special thanks also to the team that has been providing the captioning to make this webinar also accessible from that point of view. Thank you to all of you, and have a good rest of the day.
This concludes today's ILO Global Business and Disability Network webinar. Thank you for attending.